November 7, 1944, before dawn settled into the misty valleys of eastern France, fuel gauges inside dozens of American tanks hovered near empty, and mechanics, drivers, and commanders realized that without gasoline, their armored spearheads would stall at the most critical moment of World War II. The supply columns behind them had stretched thin across rain-soaked roads, bridges were clogged with traffic, and every gallon already delivered to the front had been burned during the previous day's advance. The men could smell damp earth, cold metal, and exhaust residue while they waited for word from the quartermaster, and anxiety crept through the camp because tanks without mobility were little more than heavy targets. In those early hours, soldiers spoke quietly about distances, maps, and hills yet to be crossed, and they knew that the success of the broader campaign depended on momentum. Among the maintenance, crews stood a veteran staff sergeant mechanic who had spent months keeping engines alive under fire. He listened to the concerns of platoon leaders and traced his finger across a route that wound between villages and forest tracks, imagining a way to carry fuel forward even when trucks could not stay close to the armor. The idea forming in his mind was not glamorous, but it was grounded in experience learned from breakdowns, shortages, and long nights repairing transmission housings beneath the harsh realities of combat during World War II. He remembered convoys bogged in mud, crews stranded beside silent engines, and the frustration of seeing opportunity slip away simply because fuel could not reach the battlefield in time. Now, as orders urged the division to keep advancing, he resolved to design a mobile refueling platform that could travel with the tanks themselves and keep the offensive alive. The idea felt urgent now. By mid-morning, the mechanic gathered spare piping, hoses, clamps, and welded brackets from abandoned wrecks at the edge of the field, and with a small team, he began converting an ordinary cargo truck into something new, something meant to bridge the widening gap between the fuel depots and the advancing armor of World War II. The men worked with chilled hands, cutting metal plates and bolting a salvaged pump to the truck bed, while artillery echoed from distant ridges. Every component they chose came from practical necessity. The pump was strong enough to move gasoline quickly, the hoses were long enough to reach tank-filling ports, and the brackets were reinforced to survive rough terrain. While the transformation took shape, officers visited the site and asked whether the vehicle could safely operate near the front lines, and the mechanic explained that the entire concept depended on mobility, speed, and the ability to accompany the tanks wherever they went. His language was direct, technical, and rooted in battlefield experience rather than theory, and the officers recognized that this improvisation reflected the broader spirit of adaptation that defined Allied operations in World War II. By the time clouds darkened the afternoon sky, the truck carried a mounted pump, spare drums, and racks for hoses secured with steel wire, and its crew had already rehearsed procedures for rapid refueling under fire. The mechanic emphasized discipline, grounding cables, and strict handling of open containers to reduce the risk of accidental ignition, because he understood that one mistake could threaten both men and machines. What emerged from that effort was not an official design from headquarters, but a field-built lifeline intended to restore movement to armored units whose mission demanded relentless forward pressure now. Its success would soon be tested across mud and shattered roads. Within a day, the improvised refueling truck was rolling behind the spearhead, weaving through traffic jams of artillery tractors, ambulances, and supply jeeps, and its crew learned how to identify the moments when tanks paused just long enough to receive fuel without breaking the tempo of operations during World War II. At crossroads where shells had cratered the pavement, the driver eased the truck forward and the mechanic leapt down with a hose, shouting instructions to turret crews who opened their caps and kept their engines idling. The pump growled, gasoline surged through the line, and within minutes each tank regained the range it needed to continue the advance. Infantrymen watched with curiosity, understanding that this simple innovation turned logistical vulnerability into renewed mobility. Reports reached battalion headquarters describing how the Lifeline Truck reduced delays and allowed armored companies to pursue withdrawing German forces before they could establish new defensive positions. The mechanic kept notes about distances covered, gallons transferred, and problems encountered on rough ground, because he believed that practical observation was essential to improving the design. Those notes later circulated among other maintenance sections, spreading knowledge in the informal yet powerful network of experience that developed across Allied units in World War II. For the crew operating the truck, every mission meant threading through danger, navigating near enemy artillery zones, and trusting that speed and discipline would protect them while they sustained the movement of the tanks. Sometimes they refueled in darkness, guided only by shielded lamps and whispered commands, and the mechanic could hear distant engines echoing through the hills as the offensive pressed onward beyond the horizon. Each successful run strengthened their confidence and reinforced the belief that ingenuity in the field could shape outcomes as powerfully as any formal doctrine. They carried that conviction forward. News of the truck's effectiveness spread along the Corps front, and soon other units requested guidance on how to replicate the design, prompting the mechanic to travel between workshops, demonstrate the pump assembly, and explain the safety measures that allowed rapid fueling near active battle zones in World War II. He emphasized that the concept worked not because of luck, but because it respected the realities of terrain, distance, and the unpredictable rhythm of combat. In dusty barns, makeshift depots, and shattered garages, soldiers scavenged surplus material and followed his instructions step by step, producing additional lifeline trucks that multiplied the capacity of armored formations to stay on the move. Commanders noted that the new vehicles reduced the frequency of stalled spearheads and allowed them to synchronize fuel delivery with tactical objectives, enabling breakthroughs that previously would have faltered for lack of gasoline. The mechanic took pride in watching others adopt and adapt his idea, yet he remained focused on continual improvement, testing different pump positions, hose couplings, and storage layouts to increase efficiency. Each adjustment reflected the collaborative learning characteristic of Allied logistics during World War II, where innovation often emerged from conversations among drivers, mechanics, and officers who shared first-hand experience of operational strain. As autumn turned to winter, the Lifeline trucks accompanied armored columns through fog, sleet, and frozen mud, and their crews recorded the realities of working under harsh weather while sustaining the constant demand for movement that defined the campaign. Their journals described numbed fingers gripping metal valves, engines churning in icy ruts, and the steady determination to keep fuel flowing regardless of discomfort, because they understood that every filled tank translated directly into momentum on the battlefield and into the broader strategic progress of the Allied cause. They worked without pause through nightfall again. During one particularly demanding week, the battalion advanced across a region where bridges had been destroyed and detours wound miles out of the way, and the Lifeline truck followed the armored columns through farm lanes barely wide enough for its wheels, demonstrating how logistics and maneuver were inseparable in World War II. Each detour consumed fuel faster than planners expected, and the mechanic constantly recalculated distances to ensure that no tank ran dry at a vulnerable moment. When the column halted near a ruined village, German artillery opened fire, and the crew of the truck took cover behind a stone wall until the barrage lifted. As soon as the shells ceased, they rushed forward to resume refueling, understanding that hesitation would cost precious time. The episode reinforced the reality that logistical crews faced the same dangers as frontline soldiers, and their actions under fire played a decisive role in sustaining offensive momentum. Later that evening, officers visited the mechanic and thanked him for the determination his team displayed, emphasizing that mobility remained the central requirement of the campaign. He responded modestly, explaining that the truck existed because the battlefield demanded practical solutions, and because men who worked with tools understood what machines needed to survive in combat during World War II. His words spread quietly through the ranks, strengthening respect for the often invisible effort of maintenance and supply. As the night deepened, the mechanic inspected every bolt and joint, tightening fittings by lantern light, and listening to distant engines as proof that the tanks he had served were still moving forward, drawing strength from the knowledge that his improvised design had transformed scarcity into endurance on a battlefield shaped by relentless demands. He prepared the truck for another dawn departure without complaint. Duty guided every decision he made from necessity. As winter tightened its grip on the front, temperatures dropped below freezing and snow coated the countryside, and the Lifeline truck faced new challenges that tested both machinery and crew, illustrating how logistics evolved alongside combat conditions in World War II. Fuel thickened in the cold, pumps strained, and hoses stiffened, yet the mechanic developed methods to warm components before operation, using engine heat and insulated coverings to maintain flow. The crew practiced refueling drills with gloves and scarves wrapped tightly around their faces, communicating through brief signals to conserve breath in the frigid air. Despite the discomfort, they continued to push forward with the tanks, knowing that every mile gained depended on their ability to deliver gasoline under the most unforgiving circumstances. Officers documented these winter operations in after-action reports, noting that the Lifeline truck's reliability contributed directly to operational continuity when other supply vehicles lagged behind. The mechanic regarded such recognition not as personal praise, but as validation of practical problem-solving carried out in the service of a larger mission. He often reflected on how war demanded constant learning, and how each obstacle, mud, distance, cold, or shellfire produced new techniques that would inform future campaigns. These reflections underscored the educational value of lived experience during World War II, where soldiers became both practitioners and teachers of logistical innovation. Conversations around cook fires turned into informal seminars about engine care, route planning, and risk management, and younger mechanics listened closely to the veterans' explanations, recognizing that the knowledge they absorbed might one day preserve an entire formation from paralysis on the battlefield when fuel again became scarce, and every decision carried enormous consequence. Through these exchanges, the mechanic saw his Lifeline truck inspire others. Its influence extended far beyond a single unit across the front lines. In the months that followed, higher headquarters began to standardize elements of the mechanic's design, issuing guidance that encouraged other formations to construct comparable refueling vehicles, and this process illustrated how local innovation could shape institutional practice during World War II. The mechanic observed these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and humility, aware that the truck had originated not from grand planning, but from immediate necessity at the front line. He continued to operate his own vehicle, supporting daily advances and gathering additional lessons, because he believed that field experience yielded insights no blueprint alone could capture. Along mountain roads and across river valleys, the Lifeline truck remained in constant motion, weaving through convoys and responding to urgent calls whenever tanks reported dwindling fuel. The crew's reputation grew among armored units, who viewed them as partners in every offensive thrust. Their work reinforced the understanding that victory relied not only on courage in battle, but also on the quiet endurance of those who kept engines running and treads turning across the vast distances of World War II. With each mission, the mechanic reminded his team that their efforts formed part of a larger historical process, one in which adaptation, learning, and collaboration shaped the outcome of campaigns and the future of military logistics beyond the war itself. He encouraged them to record their experiences in notebooks, believing that future generations of soldiers and engineers would benefit from honest accounts of the challenges they faced and the creative responses they devised while working under pressure at the front, where every practical improvement carried immediate significance. Through these writings, the story of the Lifeline truck spread even further, reinforcing a culture of shared knowledge that strengthened operational effectiveness wherever armored formations advanced. Its legacy grew with every mile they traveled together. One evening, the mechanic revisited the site where his idea had first taken shape, a quiet clearing near the remnants of an old farmhouse, and he reflected on how necessity, resourcefulness, and teamwork had converged to create a solution that kept American armor moving through the critical phases of World War II. The field was scarred with tire tracks and shallow craters, reminders of how close the front had once been, yet the surrounding hills now echoed only with distant engines. Standing beside the truck, he recalled that tense morning when gauges dropped toward empty and commanders worried that the advance would stall. He understood that the Lifeline truck represented more than a machine. It symbolized the resilience of ordinary soldiers who applied their skills to meet extraordinary demands. As he tightened a hose coupling and checked the pump's housing, he felt the same sense of responsibility that had guided his actions from the beginning. He knew that tomorrow the truck would again accompany the tanks into uncertain terrain, and that every mile traveled would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to refine the art of sustaining movement in wartime. In that quiet moment, the history of innovation, adaptation, and perseverance continued to unfold around him, shaped by the rhythms of engines, by the determination of crews, and by the unbroken commitment to keep the offensive alive throughout World War II. He remained aware that countless unnamed mechanics and drivers across the front were engaged in similar efforts, each contributing in their own way to the collective strength of the Allied advance, and he felt connected to them through a shared purpose rooted in duty, patience, and the enduring pursuit of mobility. That connection strengthened his resolve as darkness gathered around the clearing before another long march ahead. Elsewhere along the front, officers studying the battalion's reports began to recognize how the Lifeline truck illustrated broader principles of operational design, and they used its example in training discussions that emphasized the relationship between logistics, timing, and battlefield initiative during World War II. They explained to new commanders that every plan, no matter how bold, depended on the ability to sustain fuel and supplies at the decisive point of contact. The mechanic's story served as a tangible reminder that innovation could arise from the ground up, and that attentive leadership meant listening to those who worked closest to the machines. In classrooms established in repurposed buildings near the rear areas, instructors described the events of that November morning, the empty gauges, and the decision to transform a cargo truck into a mobile refueling platform. Students analyzed how the solution combined technical skill with strategic awareness, and how it preserved momentum when circumstances threatened to halt the advance. These educational sessions helped institutionalize the lessons of the field, weaving them into the professional understanding of officers and enlisted personnel alike. The mechanic, though unaware of every conversation, continued to influence doctrines simply by doing his job with care and imagination, reinforcing the idea that history often grows from practical actions undertaken in the midst of war. Through these reflections, the significance of his invention extended beyond immediate utility, offering a lens through which future planners might evaluate the interdependence of technology, initiative, and human judgment whenever armies sought to project power across difficult terrain and shifting front lines. In this way, the Lifeline truck became part of a larger narrative of adaptation that continued to evolve as the campaign progressed. Its lessons remained relevant wherever armies advanced. Officers carried those lessons forward into future operations across every theater of war. Back at the front, the mechanic climbed into the cab of the Lifeline truck at dawn and listened to the steady rumble of the engine as columns formed along the road, and he prepared once more to follow the tanks into uncertain ground, carrying with him the experience, patience, and determination that had defined his work since that first desperate morning of World War II. The rising sun revealed frost on the fields and thin smoke drifting from nearby villages, and the crew exchanged brief glances that communicated trust more clearly than words. They knew the day would bring new obstacles, perhaps broken bridges, scattered resistance, or unpredictable terrain, yet they also knew that the truck's mission remained unchanged: to reach the armor at the moment it needed fuel most. As the convoy began to move, the mechanic adjusted his maps, checked the pump's fittings, and reminded himself that every decision he made could influence not only the success of a single company, but the progress of the entire advance. His thoughts returned to the countless miles they had already traveled and to the soldiers whose machines they had kept alive. Those memories strengthened his resolve, guiding him as the truck rolled forward toward another stretch of road, another temporary halt, and another chance to deliver the lifeline that sustained momentum across the ever-shifting landscape of World War II. With every turn of the wheels, he carried the quiet assurance that ingenuity, discipline, and cooperation could overcome shortages and uncertainty, and he understood that the story of the Lifeline Truck was still unfolding, written mile by mile in the movement of the armored columns he served, and in the determined hearts of the crews who depended on his work. He remained ready for whatever lay ahead on every road forward. As the road curved into a stretch of rolling farmland broken by hedgerows and shallow creek beds, the mechanic focused on the subtle cues that signaled when the armored column ahead was beginning to strain its fuel reserves, and he adjusted the Lifeline Truck's speed so it would arrive just as the tanks paused, preserving the rhythm of movement that had become essential during World War II. Dust swirled around the convoy, drifting into the cab and coating the dashboard with a fine layer of grit, while the radio crackled intermittently with fragments of reports from reconnaissance units probing ahead. The mechanic studied these transmissions with practiced attention, interpreting not only the words but the tone of the voices, sensing when delays or unexpected resistance might increase fuel consumption and require faster support. When the column slowed near a crossroads bordered by shell-scarred trees, he nodded to his driver, signaling readiness. The truck pulled to the side of the road, the pump was primed, and moments later the first Sherman eased into position. The crew worked with quiet efficiency, their movements shaped by repetition and trust, each action measured against the constant awareness that even a brief lapse could compromise the safety of men and machines. Around them, infantry squads crouched in shallow ditches, scanning the tree line, while artillery observers marked distant ridges for future fire missions. The entire scene reflected the interdependence of every branch engaged in World War II warfare. Armor, infantry, logistics, and artillery, all held together by the fragile thread of fuel carried forward by vehicles like the Lifeline Truck. As the refueling continued, the mechanic noticed how the landscape itself dictated the tempo of operations, and he adapted his procedures to the contours of the terrain, demonstrating how logistics required not only technical skill but also a deep understanding of geography in World War II. In open fields, the crew positioned the truck behind natural folds in the ground to reduce exposure. In narrow lanes, they coordinated tightly with tank commanders to prevent congestion that might invite artillery fire. Each environment presented a new set of challenges, and the mechanic treated them like problems to be solved through observation and experience. He discussed these variations with other maintenance teams who gathered during brief lulls between missions, turning practical encounters into informal lessons that spread quickly across units. Soldiers spoke of ravines that trapped exhaust fumes, slopes that strained engines, and soft soil that consumed fuel at alarming rates, and they exchanged strategies for navigating each hazard. The mechanic listened carefully, adding new details to his notebook, convinced that every shared insight strengthened their collective ability to keep the advance moving. In these conversations, men from different backgrounds and specialties found common purpose in the universal demands of mobility, reinforcing the sense that the Lifeline Truck was not merely a tool, but a catalyst for cooperation across the front during World War II. Later that afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, and a light rain began to fall, turning the dirt roads into slick ribbons of mud that clung to tires and slowed every vehicle in the column, and the mechanic immediately recognized that fuel consumption would rise as engines labored to maintain traction. He instructed his crew to shorten their refueling intervals, reasoning that it was safer to top off frequently than to risk a tank stalling mid-slope with no room to maneuver under fire. The rain intensified, drumming against the truck's metal panels and blurring the edges of the horizon, while the smell of wet fuel and exhaust mingled with the scent of churned earth. Despite the discomfort, the crew worked methodically, wiping mud from couplings, securing valves, and keeping their footing on the slick truck bed. The mechanic's voice remained calm and steady, guiding every step, and his composure reassured the crews who watched from nearby positions, aware that their own survival depended on the continued reliability of the Lifeline service. The rain eventually softened into mist, and the tanks moved out once more, treads grinding through deep ruts that stretched across the fields. As the truck followed, the mechanic reflected on how weather shaped every aspect of operations during World War II, from strategic planning to the smallest act of maintenance, and he reaffirmed his belief that logistics demanded constant vigilance, creativity, and respect for forces beyond human control. As dusk approached and the sky dimmed to a muted violet, the convoy halted near a cluster of shattered stone buildings that had once formed a small village, and the mechanic prepared the truck for nighttime operations, emphasizing discipline and silence as the front grew tense in the fading light of World War II. The crew covered any reflective surfaces, shielded their lamps, and reviewed hand signals to minimize radio use that might reveal their position. The air felt heavy with anticipation, and distant bursts of small arms fire echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the fields. When the first tank rolled into position for refueling, its commander spoke in a low voice, expressing gratitude that the Lifeline truck had arrived before darkness fully settled, because his unit needed to be ready for movement at a moment's notice. The mechanic acknowledged the words with a brief nod and returned to his work, allowing his actions to speak more than conversation. As the pump hummed softly, the crew listened to the faint rustle of wind through broken window frames and the distant rumble of artillery, each sound a reminder that even moments of relative quiet existed within the broader tension of ongoing operations during World War II. When the last tank in the company received its fuel, the mechanic secured the hoses, checked the fittings one final time, and signaled the driver to prepare for movement, knowing that the night would bring new calls, new distances, and renewed responsibility along the shifting front. Hours later, under a sky scattered with thin clouds that drifted across the moon, the mechanic reflected on how his work had gradually reshaped the relationship between the armored units and the maintenance crews that supported them, forging a bond built on trust, respect, and shared hardship in World War II. Tank commanders now consulted him when planning routes, asking his opinion on gradients, road conditions, and fuel tolerances before committing to rapid maneuvers. His answers were grounded in data collected through first-hand experience, gallons per mile on steep terrain, consumption during prolonged idling, and the mechanical strain imposed by repeated combat starts. This exchange of knowledge elevated the role of logistics from a background function to a central factor in tactical decision-making, and the mechanic recognized that such collaboration represented a quiet but meaningful shift in how armies understood warfare. He often thought about how future campaigns might benefit from these lessons, how soldiers yet to come would inherit an improved understanding of the delicate balance between speed, endurance, and supply that defined armored warfare during World War II. As the truck rolled onward through the darkness, its engine a steady heartbeat among the scattered sounds of the night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that every mile traveled continued to shape not only the present battle, but also the evolving knowledge of how armies moved, fought, and endured across the broad and demanding landscapes of war.